Welcome to the Soul Garden, and we have got a really special show today. I'd like to introduce you to Terry Longley, and Terry is a third generation funeral director and is located in Havelock North in Hawke's Bay. And across the course of this interview, we're going to be looking at a whole kind of landscape of funeral and death care here in New Zealand. Terry, first up, welcome. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about being a third generation funeral director and what that means for you and what it brings to the people and families that you're working and interacting with.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. First of all, Georgina, it's nice to join you. I know we've worked together on many things, so to discuss this tonight is it's quite special. So growing up as a young fellow with dad and granddad being funeral directors is quite a different thing. At school, my brother and I were always the different kids. We were always the funeral director's sons,
right.
And that had with it an attachment in the 90s about what undertaking was. Of course, my brother and I, we were down at the funeral home most days after school. We got to watch Dad, watch Granddad, watch what they did, and didn't really realize it at the time, but we were absorbing everything. And at least I was anyway. And it didn't really impact me until a little bit later on when I grew up, just how much Dad and Granddad did for the community. We always knew they worked hard, and sometimes they weren't always around for our school trips or our sports days. Dad was out working, he was on call, and we're looking back, you just realize now how much they did for so many families. And that started to weigh a little bit more on me later in life. I left school, I did something else. I swore I'd never be a funeral director, but isn't it funny how things change as you grow up? You get older, your values change, and I started reflecting and just realizing how amazing funeral directing can be, how many people you get to help through what is usually a really vulnerable time for people.
Sure.
And funeral directors are in a unique position to really make a difference through that process. So naturally, I found my way back to Dad and Granddad. I joined them, did a month trial, and after a month, I went, this is where I should have always been. And 8 years later, here I am, still doing it, still really, really passionate about it.
What was the kind of magic moment for you when everything kind of came together during that 1 month trial that made you go, yes, this is really it?
Yeah, I think for me, it was knowing that I'd made a difference to people that were in such a dark place or going through such a hard time, which I had never really experienced that before. I mean, you help people in other ways through your life, but really these people were holding me, they were crying, they're giving me hugs and just saying, thank you so much for what you did for us. And that hits you like something different, and you never forget that feeling. And I think that's what really made me want to join and learn everything. Yeah.
What are the skills and the sort of personal attributes you think are really important for this job?
I think there's three main attributes which contribute to a really amazing funeral director. First one, without a doubt, has got to be empathy. You've got to be able to put yourself in their shoes and put yourself into their mindset and know how to help. You've got to be kind when you do it. I would say that's number two. And you've got to be a great communicator. And those three things I can't really teach someone. I can teach them everything else in funeral directing, but those are the three fundamentals that I would say really, really make a good, or the difference between a good funeral director and a great one.
I know that I'm sure that listeners and viewers of this podcast and video will find that really interesting, because I think that the funeral directing industry in a way has got a bit of a bad rap. Can you explain to the listeners what you feel funeral directing is in the current day?
Yeah, great question. And to put that in perspective, funeral directing has been around for several hundred years in what we know is in modern time. It was only in the last 60 to 70 years that the term undertaker, which is what the person used to do who showed up with the casket, put the body in it and took it to the grave, transitioned about 60 to 70 years ago to funeral director. And that shift, as you mentioned, happened around World War II when we institutionalized death, as in people started dying in hospitals and rest homes, where we took death out of the common household. Undertakers then became funeral directors, and people started asking of funeral directors to do more and more. So we weren't just the cabinet maker that knocked up the box, put the body in it. We were the ones that sat with the family and planned out that special day. We booked and arranged flowers. We wrote up the newspaper notice to advise people that someone had passed. We then realized that we needed special premises to do that, and that people wanted to come to the funeral home, or the funeral parlor, as it was called back then, to visit their loved one, because it was inappropriate to have them at home. Over the last 60 years through to today, funeral homes now just do more and more and more for the grieving family, to the point where we're actually more event managers now than undertakers, or what you would consider a funeral director. Some people think we just show up to the funeral in a nice looking suit, we drive the hearse, we look after the family, and we drive away after an hour. But really our whole job today is meeting with the family early, planning that event, seeing it through, guiding them through those decisions, and ensuring that that funeral, the burial, or the cremation goes smoothly. Of course, that is just one aspect of funeral directing. There's also care of the deceased, which a lot of people will instantly think of embalming as that part of funeral directing that everyone's scared of, or they think is gruesome. But it's actually just one part of funeral directing, and embalming is part of that. But caring for the deceased doesn't always mean embalming. So that is a part of the job that we focus on heavily today as well, ensuring that families have that lovely memory picture and that last nice image of their loved one.
You looked after both my parents for me when they died, and I have to confess, there were two very different experiences. I'm going to lead into another question with one of them, but with my father, who died more recently, I wanted to do bells and whistles for him, the church funeral and everything, and I wanted to be able to have some time kind of with him before he was cremated. So visitation was important to me, and you were amazing. The thing I found really helpful was, and when I look back on it, you can really underestimate how stressed you are as a family member who's just lost someone in that time. And I found it very, very helpful that you guys were there to just do all the, I didn't have to think about death certificates, and I didn't have to think about this and that. And that was really, really helpful. My mother was a very different situation. She had said to me, when I go, I just want to be, carted off in a box and cremated straight away. And the term in the industry is direct disposition. And that's what happened. So I never said goodbye to her really once she, left the hospital where she died. So I learned in my own experience what it meant to have that extra opportunity to say goodbye. And you spoke just before about offering the opportunity for caring for the person who's deceased for the family until the funeral, if they're not wanting to have them at home. Can you talk about the importance of that visitation, that step between the death and the funeral, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good aspect to talk about, especially with funeral directing, which is so often associated with just that 1 hour funeral at the end of the week. But the viewing or the visitation is a big part for both the family, friends, and the wider community. Now, it's usually often the immediate family. They're going to be right next to that person when they pass away. It may be that they've spent the last 3 or 4 days with that person as they got sicker and sicker. They were there at the end, and it's a beautiful time. But all the other family and friends and wider community weren't actually there. They didn't have all those special moments. They learn about the passing, and it's really important that those people get to come and acknowledge that death. And to do that, we view the body. Yeah. And that could be done at the funeral home, or it can be done at someone's home. But actually spending time with the deceased after they've passed is one of the most fundamental pathways to good grieving that we as humans can really have to process our grief. It makes it real for us. We hear about a death. Do we know that it's actually happened? Well, someone's told us, but it doesn't make it real till we see that person in the casket. Yeah. We get to hold their hand. We get to give them a kiss. The grandkids get to pop a note to granddad into the casket. Maybe that you bring a flower from your garden and you lay it with mum one last time. That time, even may it be short or long, is so important. And we encourage it to every single family that come through the funeral home. They, of course, are people that say, no, thank you. I don't need to see mum. I don't need to see dad. I want to remember them as they were. And that's okay. But everyone should at least be given the opportunity. And I think that's really important. So when a family says, or the deceased themselves, their wishes are, no, take me away, no fuss, no viewing, they're actually denying everyone they love and cared for the right to grieve properly. Yeah. And sometimes, they think they're doing it a better thing by saying, hey, no fuss, get rid of me, take me to the crematorium. But in actual fact, they're doing a disservice to everyone they loved and cared about. So we really ensure that the family know how important that can be to a lot of people. Yeah.
That moment from death really becomes about the family and friends, really, in a way, doesn't it? Giving them those opportunities. You mentioned before we have worked together. It was lovely because of the work I've been doing with people in illness and through kind of palliative and end of life care and actually bereavement. I was really fascinated to see what happens beyond my own personal experience of my family loss for people who walk through a funeral director's door, and what is the sort of compassionate care that is wrapped around them or can be wrapped around them. And I found it really beautiful. Some of the families and visitations, there were just gorgeous things being done, writing notes on the casket, putting photos in. There were so many ways of making it really personal and really special. And I was deeply moved by that, and just sitting sometimes with people when they came away from the visitation room and just needed someone to talk to. Also, that feeling of when people are saying, no, I just want to go, I mean, not forcing them to do anything at all, but just saying, hey, I really wish I'd had the opportunity to say goodbye to my mum one more time. So getting down to the sort of send off in today's world, we've talked about visitation. So let's say visitation has happened. People have had a chance to come and say goodbye. What is the most basic send-off somebody can have, even within that context of saying goodbye?
Yeah, sure. So really, a funeral doesn't need to be this big church mass with an organist and singing and hymns and prayers and things like that. In actual fact, a funeral can just be a very small gathering, perhaps at the funeral home, right before we take the person through to the crematorium or the burial. That might be just gathering up your nearest and dearest. You come down and you gather around the casket. We all share a brief story or a favorite memory. Hey, we pop on a CD of Nana's favorite music, and we put the casket lid on together. We grab a couple of flowers from the garden, and we all follow her to the crematorium.
Right.
That at least is doing something rather than nothing. And that's what's really important. We don't need to book out big venues. We don't need to have catering, although there are good reasons why you might choose to do that.
Yeah.
But it can really just be that close, nearest and dearest. That doesn't have to be at the funeral home either. That can be at someone's home. And some of the nicest funerals that I've had the privilege of directing have been right there in their garden where they spent most of their time. And that's
Beautiful.
some of the most beautiful stories. So yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
what I'm hearing you saying, and for people, is really there is no set formula or prescribed way of doing it these days. It is about kind of celebrating the life of the person who's passed and creating ceremony for those who remain. What do you do for different cultures? You know, for example, with when a Maori person dies, and I know they have different cultural traditions. Can you talk about that? How that you work in with other cultures?
Yeah, of course. And we're lucky in New Zealand to live in such a multicultural country. And we don't just have one or two. It's not just the Māori culture and the European culture. Within that, there is a huge space. Every family has their own cultural needs. And actually, every family has their own individual needs. And so while they may be leaning towards one culture or another, we tend to work with the family about what parts of their culture are important to them and honor those wishes. But there may be parts to their culture that they're not too worried about following, or it's not important to them through the funeral process. And so really, we don't just say, oh, these people are Māori, we will treat them this way because that's what the Māori culture does, or these people are Jewish, so we'll do it the Jewish way. We sit down with the family and say, hey, look, what parts of your culture are important to you? What can we do to honor those wishes? Is there anything that we can do differently that you would like us to do? And sometimes we actually find that people take little bits from each culture that they like, and we can incorporate all of those. And in actual fact, studying cultures and funeral directing as part of my diploma, we actually found that each culture does something really, really well. And so it's no surprise that some people are now picking the best bits and making it their own culture. Yeah.
So you're saying that, you know, for example, if a family want to come in and they want to wash or dress the body and things, you have space and you're able to do those and enable those things to happen.
We've certainly got the facilities there if people want to play more of a part in the care of the deceased. I think that's really important that we allow families the opportunity to do that. Of course, it's not for everybody, but those that want to do a little bit more or be a little bit more helpful can certainly take part. And washing your loved one can actually be quite a therapeutic thing. And so that's certainly possible. Yeah.
I think that's really helpful for people to hear, because I think that often we don't know what even we can ask for. So hearing you speak and sort of opening that up and basically say, look, let's just talk about all the ideas and options and things that you're wishing for, or things that we can suggest, and we can work together from there, is really good. Because I think sometimes people they get scared, don't they? And
they
not
do.
Sure
and it's not something people are good at. We haven't been through this 10 times in our life. Statistics say you'll be responsible for arranging 2.3 funerals on average in your life. So mum, dad, and if you're unlucky, maybe a spouse. So really, you're only going through this process as a decision maker once or twice in your life. The default really for us is that we're assuming that most people don't want to take part, and it's generally accepted that people will allow a funeral director to care for the deceased. And so what I would say is, if people want to take part in that, is to let us know when the funeral director arrives and say, hey, I'd like to do more here. How can I
Yeah.
help?
Yeah.
And let us
Lovely.
know then, and we'd certainly walk them through that process.
Okay. So before we move on more into body care, particularly I'm thinking as we move into people who are wanting to do more for themselves, I just want to ask, at the moment, there are only two options for human remains in New Zealand, isn't there? Cremation and burial, as I
That's correct.
understand it.
That's right.
But at the time of recording this interview, I know that last year, I think the bill for disposal of human remains, whatever the bill is called, forgive me if I've got it wrong, was under review. When we look at overseas, we're seeing a whole range of other things sort of coming in, hydrolysis and composting and all sorts of things. I was wondering if you could talk about what you're hoping the kind of the choice around what we do with human remains will be as this bill comes through.
Yeah. So, yeah, as you correctly mentioned, we're governed at the moment by a piece of legislation called the Burial and Cremation Act, which was
Right.
written, I believe, in 1964. So
Right.
it's pretty old. Back in 1964, we had limited options. We certainly did not have the technology that we have today. 2021, we're looking at advancements in cremation, which now, as you mentioned, the hydrolysis, we can actually cremate someone with water.
Right.
Is using the hydrolysis process. It's now coined the term aquamation, where the same process takes place, except it just uses water and an alkaline solution. What the family get back is actually the same ash remains. So they can still do the same things they would with normal cremation remains, or fire cremation, I should say. But it's done with zero emissions using water.
Great.
That's returned to a natural pH and released back into the normal water cycle, which is absolutely amazing. Now, I had the opportunity in 2017 to fly over to Florida, where they build cremators, and I had the opportunity to witness and test one of their brand new aquamators. I got to see it in use, and it was really, really cool thing to see. So this is already happening in Europe and America.
Yeah.
Going for at least 5 or 6 years. New Zealand is just waiting for the legislation and the law to catch up.
Right.
So they're hoping, this is going to be one of many things that will allow funeral homes and communities to have options.
Yeah.
And have environmentally friendly options, which I think is one of the most important parts there.
Yeah.
Of course, there's always going to be new conversations we've got to have around new technology and how that affects the environment and things like that. But that's one of the really cool things I would say that's going to happen in the next few years.
Great.
We can never tell how long law is going to take to change in New Zealand. It may be 3-5 years. It's going to happen. I think it's a great step forward. But we also see other things happening around the world, like you mentioned, composting.
Yes.
Which is in effect, it's a really neat idea. The idea that we can fully manifest our body back into usable soil that gets nourished by other plants and trees. And I think that's a really nice thought that resonates well with a lot of people.
Yeah.
We have come close in New Zealand to achieving that through natural burial sites around the country, which are just about there. And to explain that a little bit further,
please,
a natural burial is when we bury the body very, very low on the surface, or just below the surface, I should say, where the soil activity is quite high. It's where the moisture is. It's where all the enzymes are, and it returns the body back to the soil much, much faster, within months to a year. Right. Whereas when we bury a casket at 6 feet or 2.5 meters, there's very, very little soil activity. In fact, caskets can actually stay down there for several hundred years, depending on the moisture content, and be unaffected. So there's less breakdown. So natural burial is something that's catching on a little bit. It is still quite restrictive about what we can and can't do.
Can you explain the restrictions and what you can and can't do for natural burials? here?
Yeah, so to classify something as natural, it really requires everything that gets buried to be natural. So that limits the type of caskets we can use. So we're really only limited to natural or solid wood caskets that haven't got any glues or resins or paint or varnishes on them. The interior can only be natural cotton. The deceased can only be dressed in natural clothing fibers. So again, cottons, no synthetics or anything like that.
Yeah.
And of course, the body can't be embalmed. They class that as an unnatural process. And so the embalming process, which is what gives us time for loved ones to spend with their deceased, is then taken away, which causes us at times to do the burial sooner than we would rather like. For some families, that can be too quick. So they opt out of that natural burial because of that time period.
Okay.
So it's always a family choice. Once we've given them all that options, they then decide if they want that or not, and how important it is to them, I guess.
Yeah. So following that, the trail of natural burials, I'd really like to come on to talking about body care. And I've got a whole bunch of questions here for people, for people. Can you talk us through what happens when somebody dies? Let's say, for example, somebody has died at home, and actually also if you compare it to if they've died in a rest home or a hospice, who do people call? What do they do? You know, who do they reach for in that after someone has passed away?
Yeah, good question. And what we're assuming that we're talking about is that someone's passed away expectedly. So that person was sick, they'd been dealing with maybe cancer or heart disease, and we were more or less expecting that person to pass away. In which case, what will need to happen is that the family, first of all, need to get in touch with their GP and let them know that that mum or dad's passed away, and that a doctor in New Zealand needs to certify someone deceased before anything else can happen further. And the reason for that is just to make sure that the doctor is positive what caused the death, and that if something perhaps looks suspicious or doesn't look right, that they can actually then refer the death to the coroner. And we might be able to talk a little bit about the coronial side of things at the end. But assuming that the death is normal and expected, following the doctor's arrival, the family can then phone a funeral director. And what we would look to do is talk with the family about what they want to have happen next and what involvement they want from a funeral home. It's generally accepted that most people want the deceased taken back to the funeral home initially, just so we can start caring for it, and to slow down or start to look at how we can control the natural processes or the natural breakdown of the body. Now, it's not required for us to take that deceased away. Of course, a person can stay at home through that process, but it's a good first thought to call the funeral home and talk about that plan with your funeral director, so that they can guide you through any implications or advice about what you would like to do.
Okay. Does the so if somebody dies in the middle of the night, do you ring the doctor straight away, more or less, or do you leave it to the morning? What are you supposed to do? What's the time window that's recommended for that?
Yeah, I think it's important that you give somebody a call, either be at the funeral home. It's pretty uncommon that doctors answer their phone at night anymore. And it's even less likely that they're going to come out at 3 a.m. What generally tends to happen now is that you phone the funeral home, let them know that someone's passed away. We can get in touch with a doctor, but it's likely that the doctor will actually visit at 8 or 9 o'clock the following morning on their way to practice, and to certify the passing then. And that's totally okay. If someone passes away at night, there is no need to rush or panic through that process. They're actually going to be fine at home in bed. As long as you're comfortable that they're there at night,
Yeah.
then we're absolutely fine with it, and a doctor will be fine with it. Some
Right.
things that we advise people are, hey, maybe just make sure the electric blanket is turned off in bed, that you haven't got the heater turned up
Right.
high next to them or anything like that.
Yeah.
But if they're placed in bed and they look comfortable and you feel comfortable, then a person is going to be absolutely fine until the morning when the doctor gets there and we can get there. Yeah.
And it actually gives a very, very almost kind of sacred and intimate moment of time for the people who are gathered there with the person to be able to be and maybe to say the things that you want to say to the person that you perhaps didn't get to say in life, or read the poem that they loved or whatever. Also, you know, if you're gently sort of washing the body and things can be incredibly special way of kind of saying goodbye. I'll talking
yeah,
about.
And there is a chance there, as you said, for family to care for their loved one before the funeral director gets there.
Yeah.
And as you said, they can wash the deceased, they can make them look nice, they can get them dressed, all those lovely special moments.
Yeah.
And that's really, really nice as well.
I've done that a few times now with people, and with my own father, bless him, but also with families when a loved one has died and they've gathered round, and I have got them to wash the body with me as part of their saying goodbye, and then just oiling it with beautiful, you know, olive oil with really symbolic essential oils and things into it, and blessing the body as you go, as you're caring for it. Something about doing that before the doctors come and the funeral director and everything gets really busy is very, very special. I was speaking to somebody a while ago, and she said, you know, look, thank you for giving me that opportunity to care for my mother in that way. It's very lovely. So if people are wanting to have the body at home, and you know it's a few days before the funeral, what do they need to do? How do you advise them to look after the body to help slow that decomposition rate and things? And what are the things that they should be looking out for that would warrant a call to the funeral director to come and help them keep things controlled?
So our best advice as funeral directors and as experienced funeral home is always to look to embalm a body. Now, that's not always going to be everyone's first choice. And while it is our best practice to embalm, it gives us the most control and the best care. There are families out there that choose not to embalm, but still want to have a body at home.
Yeah.
And so what we do is we work with that family as to where best in their home to keep their deceased. We want to ensure that temperature is a factor when you're keeping a body at home that's unembalmed.
Yeah.
So making sure, hey, we're not in a room that's got sun streaming in all day.
Yeah.
The best thing that we can do to control the rate of the natural process is to cool the body down.
Right.
Now, there's certain temperatures that work best. And so what we aim to do is get the body as close as possible to 4 degrees. That's actually going to almost stop the natural processes.
Right.
It's pretty hard to do that with your air conditioner at home.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit chilly. But there are other ways that you can do that. You can do that with constant switching and moving around of ice packs. Over a few days, that requires a lot of different ice packs, and frozen peas and veggies might start running out pretty quick. But there's actually a product out there that's available for anyone to purchase and utilize, and it's called dry ice.
Right.
It's available at most gas or chemical companies, where it comes in a frozen pellet form. It's actually CO2.
Right.
And it sits at a temperature of -70. And in actual fact, we've used this several times, and it's proven throughout the country that we can keep people at home. And I've done this with a person who was at home in a hot 30-degree heat wave in Hawke's Bay for 12 days.
Gosh.
He looked absolutely perfect from the day he passed away to the day we ended up burying him. And that was due to the use of dry ice, which we just neatly packed around his body, brought the body temperature down, and there was no concerns at all over any natural processes, which gave, as I said, the family 12 days with him before the funeral.
And that's without embalming?
That was without embalming.
Fantastic.
So he never actually left the home.
Wow. Oh, that's beautiful. So I'm assuming then that a lot of that ice and things, you'd be packing it around the torso and the organs and stuff, because that's where decomposition will start and gases and things like that can happen if not kind of slowed down. What happens if that does happen? What happens if gases are building up and things? What would a person see happen and what can be done?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you raised, and you're absolutely 100% right. The first signs of natural decomposition happens in the abdomen. So it comes from our gut bacteria, which when we're alive is thriving and it's doing wonderful things in our body, and it's eating up all our food and it's creating nutrients for us. When we pass away, that gut bacteria doesn't die. In fact, it's still having a haven on your last meal. It's still very much working. It's still multiplying, and it's still giving off gas. Our body has no way to deal with that anymore. It's deceased. And so that gut bacteria is going to keep increasing. You're going to notice that the gas being produced by our normal gut bacteria will start to distend the abdomen. You may see that as bloating in the body. When that happens, it's a sign that things are certainly underway and the natural process is taking place. Soon after that, we're going to start noticing that the blood in our body, which is always a nice, that fresh red color, is going to start to turn a little bit darker. And it may be that you start seeing what's called marbling start to come through, and you can see that through the surface of the skin. And at that stage, we really have to start deciding what we're going to do next. It means that more advanced decomposition is only a day or two away, and that something then has to be done, whether that's more dry ice or perhaps an intervention from a funeral home where we might look to treat the abdomen region, or sanitize that.
So you can sanitize it and you can kind of release the tension somehow, as it were, for the gas and things. Is that correct?
That's right. Now, generally, there's no saying how quickly that can happen. And some people, and all of our bodies are different. In a sense, they're the same, but we're all very, very different. And it can all depend on a number of factors. What do we have for our last meal? What kind of medicines were in our body? How old we are? How healthy and active our gut bacteria was before we passed away. All of these things, a temperature or humidity even can play an effect. And of course, it's not always nice saying, but sometimes insects that may find their way in can also accelerate that process. So for some people, it can be a matter of hours before that process takes place. Some people might not see that process happen for a week. It's really hard to say.
So really, again, what I'm hearing is if somebody is wanting to have a body at home and do a home care and things like that, that's fine. But there are these things that you need to look for, keep an eye out for, and be kind of prepared for. But also, rather than this thing that you see people getting into where, funeral directors are here and home funerals are here and never the twain should meet, actually, there's a really beautiful bridge between the two, in that, yes, you can have your home, you can do things at home, but if you need help, assistance, expertise, somebody to come and say, hey, no, this is okay, or no, we can help you with that, that's when a funeral director can really help. I think that people forget, or maybe, I don't know, it's not even a forgetting. I think it's that thing where it's either completely out of their hands or it's completely in their hands. But what I'm hearing you say is that no, this is we can do this together in as much or little kind of interaction as we need.
I think that's a really, really good summary of it. And of course, funeral homes are the one place where you can take your loved one to be embalmed.
Yeah.
And when we mention embalmings to some families, they sometimes straight away say, oh, no, we don't want all of those chemicals pumped through our loved one.
Yeah.
And sometimes we actually take a few extra moments to educate the family on what embalming is today.
Yeah.
And in actual fact, we use now 98% water.
Right.
With only a very small percentage, that 2% of humectants and formaldehyde, which allows that natural processes just to pause for a few days. So it doesn't ever stop the body naturally going through its normal process, but it just pauses it. Now, we can do any level of embalming that the family requests. And in fact, we can actually embalm with 100% water. And that just allows us to take those nasty bacteria out through a very natural process. It's non-invasive. And it may be that the family don't want any chemicals used. And we can actually offer them 100% water embalming, which just removes and sanitizes the body very, very naturally.
Right, so you're doing...
That is an option as well.
Right, so the sanitizing is innate, just basically that's another way of helping buy more time while family are gathering and things for the...
Essentially what we're saying, as you mentioned earlier, we're just going to neutralize that nasty gut bacteria, which will give the family those few days that they want without any invasive processes or chemicals used. So yeah, that is an option we can work with families with.
Right. And are you saying also, it sounds like embalming, well, I mean, the Egyptians were pretty amazing at embalming, but modern embalming with the use of formaldehyde and things, and actually from what I've observed working with you and being in the mortuary too, is that it is very much catered to the person and to the length of time that you're just trying to hold things back until burial or cremation.
That's right. And we can embalm a body to look and present their best for 1 to 2 days before the funeral. But we've also had people at the funeral home where we've kept for up to 6 weeks because their family booked a cruise. Nana passed away, and Nana said, don't you give up that cruise. The whole family go on it. Have the funeral when I get back, or when they get back. And we had this lady in a funeral home for 6 weeks, and she looked just as nice after 6 weeks as the day she passed away. And the family got to have that viewing and visitation with her.
Right.
But we would never go ahead and do a super strong embalming for someone whose funeral was in 3 days. So as you said, we do tailor strength of that.
Okay. I've got a rather grim question to ask, but again, I think that it's an important question. In the event that there has been a death that wasn't expected, and that seems that something may have happened, whether it's an accident or a crime or suicide and things, and the death is referred to the coroner, what happens then? What do the family need to know happens then, and how is the body cared for? Do they get the body back?
Yeah, very good question. And I think this is one of the areas of death care that is least known about because it's such an uncommon process.
Thankfully.
Thankfully. Only about 10%, even less, of people in New Zealand die suddenly or unexpected. And this just means that we're unable to ascertain a cause of death, or that there's some kind of suspicious activity, or that a crime has taken place. Things like motor vehicle accidents, as you said, suicides, homicides, or any reason that the doctor doesn't really can be sure to ascertain the cause of death. Now, what happens there is that the New Zealand police need to get involved, and they act on behalf of the coroner to initially investigate what may have caused that death. So you could expect that if a death is sudden or unexpected, that the police will very quickly arrive to the place of death, and they'll be asking a lot of questions about the circumstances, what's been happening, who was the last person to see them alive, and they form a bigger picture, which is then given to the coroner. Now, a coroner is just a specialised lawyer, and in New Zealand we've got 18 coroners. Their job and their main role is to determine exactly how that person passed away, and to ensure that that type of death never happens again in the community if it can be prevented. So to do that, the police actually need to take jurisdiction of their body, and it needs to be examined by a pathologist. Now, there's not a pathologist in every city, unfortunately. So sometimes that person does need to be taken out of town to the nearest pathologist. So here in Hawke's Bay, we actually have to take our deceased to Palmerston North, a 2-hour drive, where they get their exam. A pathologist can then determine exactly what caused that person to pass away, and that person is then returned to their funeral home of choice. So it is a delay between when the death occurs and when the family can actually see that person again. Sometimes take 1 to 2 days, sometimes longer if there's complications or if it's a suspicious death. So yeah, it is a hard time. Families who aren't there when the person passed away may not be able to see that person for a couple of days, and that the police can sometimes escalate emotions, and people wonder why police are there. It's not necessarily that a crime has taken place, but they're there acting on behalf of the coroner to do that initial investigation. So.
In those cases where there has been trauma, serious trauma, I would imagine that brings a very special set of skills to the fore for you as funeral directors. Also, I'm thinking of family still wishing or being given the opportunity to say goodbye to the person who has died. Can you talk a bit about that without giving away any confidentialities or anything, but are you able to talk about those situations and give an example about how you might deal with something traumatic like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like we talked a little bit earlier on about how important it was for family to view and visit the deceased. And there's a term, closed casket, which sometimes gets thrown out there. We hear about it in movies, on TV shows, or we think of someone being in a terrible motor vehicle accident. And sometimes the family can just say, we want a closed casket. And they're actually denying themselves that beautiful viewing and visitation experience. And when someone has serious trauma, be it to the head, their body, hands, what we as funeral directors and embalmers do is try to restore as much dignity and respect to that deceased as possible, to soften the image that the family may see, should they choose to view, and try and bring them some closure. And what's really, really destructive is if you hear of a loved one that's had serious trauma or been in an accident, your mind starts racing about what kind of images that body may be in. What kind of state is it? And in actual fact, we can present most people in a casket dressed in their own clothes to the point where people can actually have a positive viewing experience. And that's done really, really carefully with really talented and special embalmers that don't try to piece everything back together perfectly, but do it to the point where the family can still spend time, recognize their son or daughter or their mum or dad, and have that time. There has never been a time in our funeral home's history where we've said people cannot view their loved one, even under the most traumatizing situations. And I give an example where we had found a man that had been in his home deceased for a number of weeks. There was not much left there to recognize him, except his hand was almost perfect. For some reason, his hand was left undecomposed. And we were able to put him in a casket. All of him was covered, except for his left hand, which still had his wedding ring on it. His
Oh,
wife was able to come in and couldn't see anything else except for his perfect left hand, which had his wedding ring on it.
oh,
And she was able to recognize the hand and the ring, hold his hand even for 5 or 10 minutes, and went, "That's my husband." And she said, "Thank you so much for allowing me to
gosh.
do that. And now I can come to terms that that is my husband that everyone's been telling me has passed away." But it
Gosh.
wasn't until she saw and felt and experienced that was she able to move through that process.
Gosh.
So that is obviously one of the most extreme situations of trauma or decomposition, yet we still were able to get a positive viewing experience out of that.
Wow.
So anywhere in between, we work with what state that person may be in, what state the family may be in, and we bring them somewhere in the middle. And I think it's all about managing expectations. We're not going to say
Yeah.
that that person looks perfect and they just look like they're sleeping. But if people know what to expect, they still deserve the right to come in and hold that
Yeah.
hand or
Yeah.
whatever it may be. So it's certainly possible. And that comes from, some talented embalmers and funeral
Yeah.
directors that have learned
Yeah.
over the years how to do that.
What I've, again, hearing through this is you're saying, have a conversation with us. This isn't, funeral directors here and you wanting to do things for yourself there. This can be a very collaborative or supportive process. There is real importance around the grief process, and a part of that grief process and part of the work funeral director will give you the opportunity to really see and acknowledge the passing of that person through visitation, through reconstructive work if required in those really tragic and traumatic situations. You've also said that in this day and age, really anything goes. There are no set rules for what a funeral needs to look like and things.
As long as it's legal, we'll say yes.
Okay, as long as it's legal. Okay, sure, right. And you're open to questions. You're excited in a way about the future, ways that the industry is going to be able to help people and families when their loved ones die, because they're hopefully in a few years' time we're going to see a whole lot of other options that are available beyond just straight cremation and burial as we know it now. And we're getting increasingly green and environmental in the way that we're looking after bodies and things as well, or some of those options. So 3 questions. 1, what are your hopes and ambitions for the funeral care industry? I'll start with that one. So what are you really hoping for as we see what's possible from what we're seeing overseas?
I would love to see New Zealand come to the forefront of what's available in technological advances to catch up with the rest of the world, so that we can apply all the amazing things that we do already in New Zealand in grief care and funerals, but with the latest technology and advancements. And so I can't wait for that legislation to catch up. Great. And allow us to take another step forward, offer families more care and more options, because it's all about choice in what we do. And the more choice we can offer, I think the more meaning people can draw from that. So really excited about that.
Great. What do you think happens when the body dies? Where do we go anywhere? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Everyone's going to have their own answer and unique view on this. For me, I always wondered, is there life after death? Is there a spirit that lingers around the body? And sometimes I've often joked to colleagues and friends, I thought, we've probably had maybe 10,000 deceased through our funeral home over the last 30 or 40 years. And I've never yet seen one thing that's made me spook out yet or worry. And I thought, surely someone must have come and tapped on my office by now, or or flickered a light bulb. I haven't yet seen it. I can't say it doesn't exist, but just not sure yet. For me, maybe it's just the value of life comes from being here and now, and when it's over, there's nothing. I think that's what gives my life value.
Yeah.
But who knows?
Who knows?
I'm always open. I'm open to learning more.
Well, let us know when you hear the tap on the door.
Yeah.
And finally, is there any parting piece of advice you'd like to share to listeners?
I think being a funeral director has allowed me to sit in, even in my 8 years, nearly 2,000 or 3,000 funerals. And over the experience in that time, I realized life is pretty short. No one knows when your time is going to be up. We all hope to live a long and prosper life, but the reality is not all of us will. And what I would say is enjoy the smaller things in life. Sometimes we worry so much about the big stuff, but dealing with a lot of families at the end of life, they all come back and say it was those little things that meant the most to them in the end. And so I would say, as a funeral director, cherish the small things in life, and those will be the things that you hang on to at the end. So
wonderful.
That's my lesson as a funeral director. Yeah.
That is really wonderful. Great advice. And Terry, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom and practicalities and things with us.
You're so welcome, and it's so nice to join you on a podcast. I know we've talked a lot about this, and to converse with you. It's actually it's really cool, and I think it's a great thing.
Great.
To
and
put the knowledge out there.
Yeah. And I might just say to people, if you've got questions and things, other questions around death care and stuff, why don't you drop me an email, and if I get a list of them together, perhaps we can do a follow-up session as well and get you back again.
I'd love to hear any other questions, curly or not, what other people have got to ask, and
Okay.
I'll open them honestly. So
brilliant.
So
Thanks so much, Terry. Thank you. It was really great to have Terry Longley on this show, and I found it fascinating. He gave us a lot of information around what happens at the funeral part of death and dying. If you're wanting to find out more about his organisation, you can find him on tlas.co.nz. That's Terry Longley and Son. And if you would like to explore more about my work, where I combine nature and compassion and soul in care at the end of life and in care for everyday life, you can find me at my website, centernatureconnection.org. I'm Georgina Langdale, and this was another episode of The Soul Garden.